Yeah, so morality. I think this is an extremely important question for us to discuss today because, as Renu was talking about, what we see is actually the class struggle playing itself out in the moral sphere. If you see a lot of the arguments, a lot of the debates that are occurring in our society about what is right or wrong, right? And even a lot of the hatred against the ruling class, against different politicians, against billionaires is about something moral. They're not a good person. So-and-so did XYZ bad thing, you know? And you see this especially with questions like Gaza. You see this, I think what you see is a crisis in morality, actually, of the dominant morality in our society, of bourgeois morality. You see a crisis in it. You can see that with Gaza. You can see that with, for example, the killing of the United Healthcare CEO, which a lot of people actually somewhat supported in some way, even though if you ask these people, most people would be opposed to killing. But what we're seeing is a breakdown in bourgeois morality. So yeah, this is an extremely important question for us to wrap our heads around this. First I want to start with just what is morality? So yeah, as Marxists, we don't believe in an abstract ahistorical morality. Now, me saying that, some people would probably say, haha, therefore you're amoral, you don't have morals, which is not the same thing and is not true. But what we do is we look at history, and you look at morality throughout history. And when you do that, you do realize that there is no abstract ahistorical morality that we're quite often taught in school. You're quite often taught that morality is this thing outside of us, right? That it's apart from society, floating above it. The most classic representation of this is the sort of the commandments, or like a religious appeal to religious morality. The right wing like to do this. Our friend Charlie Kirk was constantly doing this as like, it's a Christian morality. That's what Western civilization is all about. But yeah, we don't believe in that. Actually, in many ways, their argument is kind of puts everything on its head. It's kind of a backwards argument, as I hope to describe. So, just a few examples. I'll just give a few examples of how there isn't an ahistorical morality. Cannibalism. We all, I hope, find that morally bad, right? Modern anthropology has quite clearly showed that human societies went through a phase in which that was actually accepted in some form. Now we look back at that as that's really bad, that's horrible. Yes, it is. But what does that teach us about morality? Were these people and why did they do that? There's lots of examples. Infanticide, the killing of babies, is bad, right? We're opposed to this. This is used as an argument to invade Gaza, right? The killing of babies. And then it's used as a counter-argument of why Israel is bad, because they kill babies. So this is generally accepted as a bad thing. But again, modern anthropology has demonstrated that in a certain phase of development, human society, some form of infanticide was actually morally acceptable. I'll get into why. There's a big why here. Slavery, another one. We all disagree with that, I hope, again. Everyone looks back as that's a really horrible blight on the past, is that humans, it's a sign of a barbaric past when we just didn't understand the new enlightened morals of today. But why? At one point, it was actually, a couple thousand years ago, in ancient society, it wasn't actually considered morally bad. It was actually just sort of somewhat normal for large parts of the world. We have to understand why that is. So what we believe is that these different moral beliefs that we see throughout different stages of development of society are not simply random, horrible things that one society did or another, but are simply reflect deep changes in the development of society, and above all, in the development of the productive forces. I hope that point was made earlier in the presentation on philosophy. But yes, this plays itself out here. I'll describe why. For example, a hunting and gathering mode of production, where you have no stable surplus, which would quite often, societies that were lived by this method of procuring what you needed to survive, would have moments of mass scarcity. You don't have animals, you don't have gathering. What would happen to the society in that moment? You wouldn't have enough to go around. So, hence, some form of cannibalism sometimes would enter as something that was morally acceptable. Same thing with infanticide. More mouths to feed. I'm not saying I support that. I'm saying that we have to look at these things as a certain stage of development, that what is morally acceptable or not arises out of the productive relations of society. Slavery. Slavery, if you think about it, makes no sense if the level of productivity of labor, each human can only produce enough for themselves. Then why would you enslave somebody else? They can only produce enough to feed themselves. So what you see is slavery does not exist until the development of the productive forces is so much that the slave can actually increase the wealth of the person enslaving the slave. So you have to have a certain development of the productive forces for slavery to become a form of society, a mode of production. And also connected to this is connected to the old communal agricultural communes of society, which generally everyone was a part of and took care of everyone, those things breaking apart. And when those things breaking apart, people, there's a lot of people that are kind of thrown by the wayside. They become indebted to others. And you start seeing slavery actually first arise as a form of indentured servitude, where you have to basically work for somebody else to pay off the debt. And it's all connected to the rise of money and the rise of classes and all these things. If you read ancient Hebrew and Greek sources, they actually talk about this as it's normal. It's a normal thing in society. Because slavery was actually essential for that society at that point in its development. It played an essential role in production, and actually the entire civilization of ancient Greece, with all of its cultural achievements, philosophy, art, culture, sculptures, we all know that stuff, right? A lot of what we know today and the developments in our society are actually based on that. And as Hegel said, society did not liberate humanity did not liberate itself from slavery so much as through slavery. That this allowed a certain layer of society to be freed from manual labor, from the productive process, from the direct productive process, to philosophize, think, develop art and culture. And that's why you had this golden age in ancient Greece. That's one of the reasons why. So yes, slavery is morally apprehensible. We oppose slavery. But in order for it to be abolished, it needed to become redundant historically. Actually, abolitionism in the United States became a widespread idea only when the working class became a mass force. And the free laborers, the nominally free laborers under capitalism, had rapidly grown because of the Industrial Revolution. So the economic conditions had to be laid first for the abolition of slavery. So yes, I hope the point I am trying to make here, I'll just quote Trotsky, who describes it probably better than I could, is, quote, morality is the product of social development. And that's what we believe. And we believe we can attain a higher level of morality. But that's not through just wishing it or morally shaming individuals who do bad things, but it's about through a material revolution in our society. I'll get more into that. So yeah, another example of this is, everybody knows this, you're not supposed to steal things. Thou shalt not steal, right? This is treated as timeless. This is treated as an ahistorical thing that's been a moral precept for all time. It's in the Ten Commandments, right? It's taught to us as this has been ordained from God. But let's take a look at that. Thou shalt not steal. Well, for that to make any sense to society, you have to already have private property. You have to already have classes, and you have to already have an inequality in wealth with haves and have-nots. So even this basic thing that we could all agree on, generally speaking, that is taught as if it's just a universal moral thing, could have only existed if the conditions for thievery existed before. So, as you see, there's lots of these types of questions. When you think about it for a minute, you come away with a deeper understanding of the process of development of history and then the morals that come along with that development of society. What was the big material change in society that led to private property, classes, haves and have-nots, and therefore even the concept of stealing something could only exist after. The agriculture, what we know now as the Neolithic Revolution, the agricultural revolution, about 10, 12,000 years ago, people first were able to domesticate animals, cultivate plants, and society became more sedentary, and we could produce, instead of the hunter and gathering, where it was very precarious, you were able to produce a mass surplus that could last for a long period of time. You could sustain a bigger population, you could have cities. And on that basis, before that, having actual classes in society was very difficult. It was very hard for that to develop. But this is what happened. You had this agricultural revolution, and this is what birthed class society. It didn't happen overnight. It was a process of hundreds of years, actually, of class struggle between the classes. And in that class struggle, morality was a question. If you are a king of ancient days or a ruling aristocrat in ancient Greece or ancient society, and you own more, you have a bunch of slaves and you own a landed estate and you have people that work for you and you are extracting wealth off of them, you got to be careful, because all of these people are probably at some point not going to be very happy with that relationship. And this is what you see throughout class society. So you have a need to teach them in some way, whether it's religiously or in a legal code, about what is acceptable or not. And this is where you start to have various legal codes that come into existence about don't steal, you can't do X, Y, Z, so-and-so's goat can't be touched, whatever. As Marx described in the Communist Manifesto, the ruling ideas of any society are the ideas of the ruling class. And that actually means morality as well. The ruling morality of any society is the morality of the ruling class. This eventually becomes codified in a religious form. That's very useful, because if you said, well, we said that you can't do this, they say, well, who the hell are you? You're the guy that's ruling me. I'm not going to believe. Oh, but God said you can't do it. Oh, well, if God said I can't steal or I can't whatever, fornicate with so-and-so's whatever, then I guess I won't do that, right? And this was sort of, actually, everyone's laughing. That was a very important question, because sexual relations and family units were a basis of wealth and power. There's a stable unit for the development of society at a certain level. Also, the family comes into existence at a certain level of development here, and all the morals that come along with the family. So, yes, when you have class society come into existence, you have, inevitably what you have is moral hypocrisy, because you have one class that's arguing certain things to protect their material interests, and then you have those that are there ends up being friction, because the moral precepts of that society don't help the poor and oppressed. I'll get into that today, because there's many things that is considered moral by our society. For example, I was talking to some comrades just a bit earlier. It's generally considered, if you question wage labor, selling your time for a wage and you make profit for somebody else, you're looked at funny. People look at you like, what's wrong with you? What is wrong with this guy? You're a crazy communist. That doesn't make any sense. This is normal, right? When actually, when you look at it, actually, this is not normal. This hasn't existed for very long at all. But it's considered moral, generally speaking, in our society. Of course, more and more people are questioning it. And that's the breakdown of bourgeois morality in our society. But yes, this is an example of in our society. I believe at a certain point in the future, people will also look back at wage labor and say, can you believe those backwards people? They thought that that was moral. And there was hundreds of millions of poor people and this ruling elite that were doing space trips and sex islands and weird things. And they will look back at it as a crazy time. In the same way that we look back at the debauchery of the feudal lords and the slave aristocrats and all this stuff. We have to take ourselves out of our own society, look above it as a stage in historical development. So yes, this is what I meant by Charlie Kirk is looking at things backwards, because they take our current morality as if it's a historical morality that's existed for all time, when that's an extremely backwards way of looking at things. And it's very convenient for the ruling class as well. So yes, that you have this moral hypocrisy in class society. Probably one of the best examples of this, we've all been victim to this lately. Political violence is unacceptable, right? From the same people carrying out a genocide, killing people in the streets, torturing people, doing all sorts of stuff. All of this stuff. So official morality they teach that there's rules of conduct for all, and we should all obey by them, and killing is bad, and torture is bad, and rape is bad, and you shouldn't abrogate any of these rules. But as capitalism enters into crisis, obviously the ruling class does not obey by these moral rules don't apply to them, and everybody knows that. I think the whole saga with the Epstein files is enough for why do the liberals not want to release it? Why did the Trump not want to release it? Because they're all in it. They are all involved. They are all morally corrupt in that sense. So there's this moral hypocrisy. But yeah, this universal kind of abstract morality is useful for the ruling class because throughout history it creates social order. It unites classes together which have different interests. It creates an illusion of social harmony. It creates an illusion of we all have the same interests, right? We all morally should stand for the same things. But this is only an illusion. And yes, this is the ruling class foisting its morality on society. And you look at it, they're really straining to foist morality on society. Under feudalism, which I talked about a little bit already, feudal morals were very much about loyalty and honor and a strict adherence to not equal rights for all. It wasn't all men are created equal. That comes later. It was strict social hierarchy. You had the king, you had the lords, the barons, the knights, the whatever, and at the bottom were probably the peasants' wives and other stuff, right? And everyone had to know their place in this rigid hierarchy. And you had to be loyal to it, right? And there were all of these moral rules about how we needed to live as good Christians, in Europe at the time. And this was absolute hypocrisy. And actually, in the revolutions against feudalism, morality played a role. You see it when you read about the French Revolution or the English Revolution. There's all these discussions about what the king's doing, what his wife did, or how rich they are, or whose gold they took, or he can't have a kid. Oh my God, that's bad, right? Because morally you're supposed to have kids and reproduce. And who's going to be, and then the backstabbing. There's all of a sudden, you're supposed to be loyal to this hierarchy until a succession crisis happens, and then it's no holds barred, and you can fight to determine who is the next king. So there were all these moral hypocrisy, all these questions that were bleeding through the politics of any revolutionary era that you saw, even against the feudal era. So it's very much like today. You see all these debates about what is moral and what is not, and especially I think with social media, The wheelings and dealings of the ruling class are on display on Twitter, on TikTok, on Instagram regularly, and we're all hearing gossip about it, and everyone knows how hypocritical these people are. But I guess the question, so I've already established, I hope I've really nailed down the question that there is no abstract ahistorical morality, and that under class society, the morality is inherently hypocritical, and it's an attempt by the ruling class to foist on society their rules. But if the morality of class society is always hypocritical, then why do the working class believe it at all? That's a question you have to answer. Well, really, this isn't an abstract question. This is connected to the development of society. So as long, and this is a fundamental belief of a Marxist philosophical belief, something that Marx uncovered about how society develops, is that as long as a society, a socioeconomic system like capitalism, is able to develop the productive forces of humanity, it develops society along with it. And most people will tend not to question what is preached to them as much, whether it's in slave times or feudal times and even in capitalist times. But when that system can no longer develop the productive forces, what happens is it starts to have reverberating effects throughout every level of society, throughout the politics, throughout the world diplomatic system, throughout military conflicts, throughout and through the morality of society, is that people start questioning it. All the entire ideological superstructure of that society is brought into question. And that is what we are seeing today, because capitalism can no longer develop society like it did in the past, and that's why we're having this crisis of morality that is so undeniable. Probably the best representative of this is Donald Trump. I think everyone admits this man is completely immoral. He does whatever he wants to serve his own interests and the interests of his friends. But And actually, all the criticism of him from the liberal establishment has been of what character? It's been of a moral character. It's been, he's a really bad guy. Now, did that stop people from voting for him? It didn't, actually. A lot of people voted for him anyway, because they also know that the other liberal gang is guilty of most of the same things. So I think for a lot of people, it's kind of like, yeah, you're all corrupt. Who cares? You're all immoral anyway. This guy's promising me something. Now, we don't support Donald Trump. I'm just making the point that this is the moral debate playing itself out in our society. So Ted Grant, one of the greatest Marxist theoreticians of all time, and the founder of our International, he explained this, and I believe this accurately explains what is occurring before our eyes. He said, amorality takes shape usually in a period of breakdown of the old social system and the transition to a new social system. With the loss of function of the old ruling class, the moral codes pertaining to its rule also break down. And similarly, in the period of transition, the new morality based on new relations of production also takes time to emerge. So yes, this is the period that we are undergoing. It's a collapse in bourgeois morality and a questioning of the system and all the ideological superstructure that comes with it. And we are fighting for a new system with a new morality, ultimately, a higher level of morality. So yes, moving on, because I'm going to run out of time. And I'm told the chairperson is a hard ass. Okay. So yes, you've had this moral hypocrisy under slavery, under feudalism. I've covered. You also have, and you have this moral hypocrisy today. But when you had, but there are moral philosophical schools under capitalism. We've probably heard about them or learned about them in university, and even if you didn't learn about them, you've been victim to the method. You have. Because all bourgeois talking heads and people use these moral schools, even if they haven't read them. It is so innate through all society. And I'll go through it. So as feudalism was collapsing and capitalism was rising, the old moral codes disintegrated, and you had to be replaced with something. And you had, yes, liberté, égalité, fraternité of the French Revolution. You had the all men are created equal. And you had, but that's not enough. You also had to have, well, if we are not a part of some feudal hierarchy ordained by God, how do I know who is right or wrong? Because usually the Lord can do no wrong, or the king can do no wrong, you know? He can do almost whatever he wants to the peasantry. But now we're done with that. So how do we know what is right or wrong? You had law, but you also had moral philosophy. So probably one of the most famous ones is Kant's moral or categorical imperative. So this is a very popular one. It basically believes that you should only act in a way that if you that you think that should become a universal law. So you should never act just in your own interest in one moment, but you should question, would that, like, it's kind of like do unto others as you would wish to be done unto yourself in a certain way. It should be, if you believe that should be the universal way society runs, then you should act in that way. If you don't, then you shouldn't act in that way. Connected to that, for example, you shouldn't lie, because if everyone lied in society, society would break down, it would cease to function, it would be immoral. Connected to this, Kant believes that I'll just quote him, he says, act as to treat humanity, whether in your own person or in another, always as an end and never as a means. So he clearly believes that the means does not justify the ends. It's connected to this maxim about act only in a way that you believe should be a universal law. Another school, and I believe they're kind of related somewhat, because if you notice, Kant's categorical imperative it could be seductive a little bit morally. It seems like, right, yes, we should only act as though we would think society should operate on that way, right? We will get into the problems with this in a minute. This actually is a problem for the bourgeoisie, which is why they have something called utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, which is basically the theory that morality should be based on seeking the greatest possible happiness for the greatest number of people. Again, seems nice, right? Who could disagree with this? It does have the advantage that it is more flexible than Kant's philosophy, because, for example, this would mean the means can justify the ends. If you're a choice between 5 people dying or 1 person dying, you would clearly choose the 1 person dying because more people would be happy this way. So this is the utilitarianism of Bentham. It's the greatest possible happiness, so the ends can justify the means for the happiness. But both of these schools, I believe, are extremely abstract, divorced from real society, and actually completely divorced from the real moral conundrums that we face. And coincidentally, I would say these, as I mentioned, these are the moral philosophies pursued on the news by mainstream bourgeois politicians to justify very horrible things. For example, political violence is unacceptable, is ultimately the logic of Kant's categorical imperative, because it says, oh, but that's a universal law, right? Completely hypocritical from people that are based on a system based on violence. But utilitarianism, we have to invade Gaza because Hamas is really fucking evil, right? This is utilitarianism. It's like, once we defeat Hamas, we can use whatever means to do it, we'll have greater happiness, right? This is basically what's preached by Benjamin Netanyahu. So yes, this is sort of these dominant moral philosophical schools. I'll get into a bit what Marxists believe about it. So we ultimately believe that, like I said, the morality of bourgeois society is breaking apart, and we ultimately believe that what you have developing is the class morality coming through. That what you have is the bourgeoisie and the ruling class, the politicians, will use, and they often do, use whatever moral justification for their wealth, for their system, for the oppression, for wars, for you name it, right? And the working class also does use moral arguments to justify its aims. You go on strike. Nobody can get their mail. That's morally bad. You see the bourgeoisie, they talk about that. How will people get their welfare checks? These evil postal workers, right? How can it possibly happen? Oh, Air Canada flight attendants went on strike, and then my grandma couldn't get home for whatever, you know? I saw lots of stories about this. This is all a moral argument. So what do we stand on that? So we're opposed to strikes, right? Therefore, because of abstract morality. No, we're supporting the strike, and I'll explain why. Well, Trotsky, we do believe that the means justify the ends. But as Trotsky said, a means can be justified only by its end, but the end, in turn, needs to be justified. That comes from his Their Morals and Ours, which I believe we have copies of at the table. Renu has one here. I highly recommend that text. It's about class-based morality. So yes, in a revolutionary civil war, a revolutionary will justify violence because it's a civil war, and in a civil war, the object of a civil war is to kill as many on the other side as possible to put an end to the civil war. So for example, and actually you see the bourgeoisie don't question this when it pertains to their civil wars. But when it has to do with a workers' uprising, like in the Russian Revolution and the subsequent Civil War, Lenin is bloodthirsty and so many people died, right? They're prepared to drown a revolution in blood, but as soon as the oppressed rise up and fight back, that's morally apprehensible. But yeah, what you see here is the revolutionaries will justify revolutionary violence as a means to an end, so that the revolution can be victorious, so that capitalism can be abolished, and so that we can construct a world with equality, with enough for everyone to survive. That's the end, and the end is justified. The means is justified by the end, and the end is justified. But a counter-revolutionary justifies the maximum violence. The whites in the Civil War in Russia justified horrible things against the revolutionaries to try to drown the revolution in the blood, to justify their end, which was the maintenance of imperialism, the maintenance of capitalism, and the maintenance of drudgery and exploitation of millions and tens of millions of people. So yes, we have to start from what is the ends that we are fighting for. But back to the moral philosophy that I was referring to, the utilitarian theory doesn't actually tell us who is right in this conundrum. And therefore, it's very useful to the ruling class. As I mentioned, the justification of the Gaza invasion was used on utilitarian grounds. As capitalism decays, it increasingly sheds this hypocritical abstract morality and becomes more and more clear that the bourgeoisie are just pursuing their own interests. They have trouble justifying it on universal grounds. Again, I think Trump clearly expresses this. He says things that I think normal bourgeois politicians don't like because he doesn't mask it in morality half the time. He's just like, hey, we should take Greenland. We should just kill all these people over there because we don't like them. Whereas normally the liberals would be like, wait a minute, that's not what you're supposed to do. But this is just a hallmark of a system that's degenerating and the morality is breaking down. So, and this is why the ruling class despises Trump. A lot of the ruling class despises him because he's unmasking the immorality of their system. He expresses the interests of the American ruling class a lot of the time very openly, very directly. And actually, in a weird, distorted way, part of that makes him popular because people are sick of the hypocrisy. You've heard this, at least he speaks his mind and he says what he means, even though what he says is bad. People are sick of being lied to, you know? And you see that as a common thread in these debates. But this isn't because a lot of the people that voted for him or the masses lack morals, but it's because they despise the old order and they're looking for a way out and they're looking for something new. And many just assume that they're lying about Trump. They think they're lying. They think they're all lying. So yeah, here we have this decay of morality under capitalism and this class split in the morality. So what do communists stand for? Is communism moral? So yes, with the old morality breaking down, the question is, what is it to be replaced with? Which means, it's breaking down, which means that they can't force the working class to accept their arguments anymore and to submit to the morality of the ruling class. And there is a kind of yearning for a new moral system. And we believe that is a morality of the working class. So, abstract moral questions are torn asunder, and you have, in the concrete context of the class struggle and in the revolution, right? I already mentioned the morality of a strike, the morality of a picket line. The means justify the ends. What is the end? Now, for communists, the end is fighting to overthrow a system in which workers have to go on strike, in which workers cannot get enough to survive. We want to do away with that system so that they don't even have to make that choice in the future. And the means to get there can be varied. Now, someone could say, that means that you justify any means to get to communism, including killing people and violence and terrorism, etc., etc. I'll deal with that point here. This is not true. This is how do we address that question? Because you get that all the time. Communists are bloodthirsty, right? Get used to it. If you're a communist, get used to that, because that happens. They're not going to stop saying that. They'll always say this. But how do you respond to that? We'd say this is absolutely not true, and it's absolutely hypocritical coming from people that defend this system. Violence is a fact of life under capitalism. There's violence constantly. The system, if you notice what Mark Carney is doing, he's increasing military spending to the biggest level since World War II. Why? Why do you need more guns, military ships, military submarines, military helicopters, F-35s? Well, they're going to use it for violence. They're rumored that in the budget, they'll be cutting almost everything. Almost everything. Some things they will not be cutting. They will be increasing the funding to. The military's one. The police is another. Why are they doing that? What are the police? They have a monopoly on violence, and they have guns. And they're there to maintain the order of capitalism as it's decaying. And Mark Carney is not stupid. He is an astute bourgeois politician, and he knows that they're preparing for a storm. There was a study by the RCMP last year that came out that said that with the economic decay of Canadian capitalist society, you could have a revolution. They actually entertained that point. You can have a breakdown of relations, a polarization of politics, and with it, more strikes, class radicalization, and violence. Thievery. I don't blame some people for stealing shit from Loblaws because they're poor and they don't have enough to eat. And actually, in Mark Carney's increased funding for the RCMP is included reduced bail times for people. They called it mass theft from grocery stores. Why are they doing this? It's very obvious. Society is breaking apart and they need to try to keep it together with violence. So communists fight against this. We fight against real violence that's happening, and they're preparing it, right? So it's not a question that we support violence. We're fighting against violence. We are fighting for a peaceful revolution of the vast majority of society against this tiny, greedy minority that's sucking up all the wealth and that's provoking war and destruction around the world. But in this struggle, are we pacifists? So I'll deal with the question of pacifism because this is a common one you see on the left in the movement sometimes. Oh, I don't believe in violence. I'm a pacifist, and therefore I'm not a Marxist because Marxists believe in violence. So pacifism rejects violence in principle, regardless of context. So this is a warning here. When we're discussing moral questions, If you noticed, the utilitarian argument and the categorical imperative are both complete abstract moral formulas. I believe so is this. You will never find solace in an abstraction. The truth is always concrete, and especially with moral questions, you need to go into the actual concrete situation and determine what is the most moral thing in any given situation, judged from how is this going to lead us closer to the end of the abolition of capitalism and the establishment of communism. That is what is moral. And in order to do that, actually, we don't support terrorism. Why? Some would say, oh, but you would justify anything for communism. That won't lead us closer to communism. That actually leads us backwards. Why? Because what class needs to lead is the only class that can lead to communism? The working class. And communism is a system in which the working class runs society. And it's a democratic system in which the working class runs society. And it can't be achieved, therefore, by a small band of revolutionary heroes assassinating billionaires, even if we don't like them. And I don't cry for them, but you can't achieve a socialist revolution that way. So therefore, no, we don't justify anything. We justify, I'll quote it here, what is moral for us is anything that unites the proletariat, fills their hearts with irreconcilable hostility to oppression, that teaches the proletariat contempt for the official morality and its democratic echoers, and imbues the proletariat with consciousness of their own historic mission that raises their courage and their spirit of self-sacrifice in the struggle. That's what Trotsky defines as moral for communists in Their Morals and Ours, which again I think you should read. It's anything that unites the proletariat and gives them faith in their own force in history to fight for a new system. And therefore, individual terrorism does not do that. It does the opposite. It puts belief in a small band of heroes or one person. So that is therefore, from the standpoint of Marxism, not moral. So, yes, like I said, we fight against the violence of the police. We fight against the violence of the military, of imperialism, but again, we're not pacifists. Very good example of this, of why. In Sudan in 2019, there was a revolution. The revolution occupied Khartoum, the main square in Khartoum, the capital city. A general strike shut down the government. The working class essentially had power, but was not aware that it had power. Could have seized control of society and begun the socialist revolution. The leadership of this movement were pacifists and believed in nonviolence. Meanwhile, the RSF, which are basically fascists, a military militia that was coming into town, brought in to crush the revolution. And the dominant idea was from these people, from the leadership, we are pacifists and we will not resist. What happened? Well, I don't know if you followed the events of Sudan in the past number of years. It's an absolute bloodbath. Things have descended into a civil war, and it's an absolute bloodbath between the RSF and the military. And the revolution was drowned in blood. Is that moral? Was it moral? Was pacifism moral in that situation? We would argue pacifism was actually immoral. It increased the violence, and it increased the bloodshed, and it drowned the revolution in blood. What was moral in that situation would have been for the proletariat of Sudan to arm itself, to split the military on class lines, appeal to them to join the revolution, and to arm themselves against the RSF and defend the revolution with violence, yes. And that would have been absolutely moral. It would have decreased the violence and death, and it would have given the possibility to move on to a higher stage of society. So yes, this is why we are not pacifists. Pacifism is not only useless, but it is extremely dangerous, actually, therefore. Because it places, if you think about it, it places all violence regardless from which class or from what group of people and for what end, on the same plane of judgment before the seat of reason. The violence of a slave that is trying to break his chains to get freedom is therefore the same as the violence exerted by a slave owner to keep the slave in the chains. We do not agree with that. The violence of the Palestinians to fight against the occupation is not the same as the violence of the Zionist occupiers of the IDF. So this is what pacifism does, and this is why it leads to reactionary conclusions. So yes, it's the job of Marxists not only to fight against bourgeois morality, the official moral system, but to unmask this false, hypocritical morality that can exist quite often from like petty bourgeois activists and people like this. Because ultimately the result is that it defends the capitalist system. So yes, what do we stand for? Like I said, we always get attacked for being bloodthirsty and immoral. And many people get caught in this moral war and kind of accept the framing of it sometimes. We got to be careful we're not doing that. We need to, I think a good example of this is we talked about it a bit in the last session, like kind of this postmodern tendency it's not even in a organization, but it's pretty pervasive throughout society of this moralizing about individual actions, this, that, and the other thing, of checking people, of guilt-tripping them, of canceling people for XYZ action and stuff like that. And it's led, and actually attacking the left, everyone on the left attacking everyone else on the left. It's led to a disintegration and a complete disorganization of the left, in particular the revolutionary left. And from our standpoint, we believe that is therefore immoral. And it has not led to anything good. That a lot of the left has spent more time moral policing than fighting for a new society that would have a higher level of morality. So as communists, we got to turn our backs on that. And as Trotsky explains, he says, a revolutionary Marxist cannot begin to approach their historical mission without having broken morally from bourgeois public opinion and its agencies within the proletariat. So you should be on guard against petty bourgeois moralism in the movement. That this pressure everywhere to submit to the dominant morality. That, this pacifist morality that and this idea, we get this all the time, that you shouldn't build a party, you shouldn't sell your paper, you shouldn't try to recruit people to a Marxist organization and educate them. You shouldn't ask people for money to do so, even though we live in a capitalist society and we have to fund ourselves. We live in the society, that's the only way we can do it. We're not only fighting against bourgeois morality, but also against these petty bourgeois moralists. We defend the working class morality, and therefore, which gives us the ability to fight for a new society and a new system with a higher form of morality. So is communism moral? Yes, communism is moral. It actually is the only consistently moral thing you can do. To quote Trotsky, he says, to participate in this movement with open eyes and with an intense will, only this can give the highest moral satisfaction to a thinking being. And I believe Marxist philosophy on morality is if you want to, for your life, even individually, help you understand what is moral or not and what is the right thing or not to do, turn your back on bourgeois moral philosophy and study and adopt Marxist moral philosophy. So, and what we're talking about, why is communism moral? Communism, the end, it is the movement of our class, of the laboring class of society, which makes up the overwhelming majority of society, which produces all of the wealth in our society, is the only class that can finally put an end to class society and its hypocritical morality. And anything that strengthens this aim is justified and moral, and we all have the duty to work towards that goal. Amidst And yes, we're standing amidst a collapsing, decaying society, amidst the horrors and moral decay of capitalism. I am confident that we will build a new society with a new morality, free from exploitation, oppression, inequality, and free from the stinking moral hypocrisy that we see all around us every day. I'll leave it at that.